And apparently that's all you have to do. And I guess I guess you would be a little less mobile, but you could always pick it up and put it in your hand if you wanted. Do you want me to clip this on you, or you want to clip it on?
Are we supposed to clip it on ourselves?
Yeah.
I don't want to clip
Your
it on
news
myself.
counter.
I know, I feel like... Is that a good place?
Yeah. We won't be able to hear it, so that's fine, you know?
Yeah.
It's for the webcast.
So we're going to go ahead and get started with the informal introduction part of our seminar, and then we'll do the formal introduction portion. The informal is not being webcast. And we just have enjoyed having everyone introduce themselves. Okay, so now is the official introduction. So my name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Urban Studies and Planning, and along with my colleagues Chris Monsier and Ron Bertini, we co-organize this weekly transportation seminar. And today we have two speakers. Before I do that, I'm going to remind everyone that we are webcast, and because of that, we'd like you to use the microphones that are in front of that are on most of the tables in front of you. If you do ask a question, we're going to ask you to wait until the speaker is done to ask the questions. But please use the microphone, hold the touch button, keep the red light lit while you're asking the question so the people on the web can hear the question. And those of you who come every week have heard that spiel a lot, that we have new faces. So I appreciate you doing that. So without further ado, we have two speakers today that we're quite happy to be presenting. We have two of our MURP students, Masters of Urban and Regional Planning, two students who are about to finish up, and today they are presenting the research that they've been working on for their field area papers, which is part of their degree program. And I will go ahead and introduce them both now, and we'll hopefully have a quick transition. So our first speaker is Erin Wilson, who is a second year and completing MURP student who will be finishing up shortly and going to work for PB Consult when she is done, where she has been interning. So quite happy for her employment. And then secondly, we'll have Sumi Malik, who is also a second year MURP student finishing up, and will be moving on to work for CH2M Hill after graduation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Jennifer. When I was looking for a topic for my field area paper, I'm specializing in transportation, so I wanted, obviously, a topic that related to transportation. In addition to that, I really wanted a topic that got into behavior choice and why people are choosing to take transit. I was also interested in economics, and so looking a little bit at transit cost. So I talked to my advisor, Jennifer Dill, and she said that TriMet, working on the employer commute options program, had a great data set that they were looking for a student to evaluate. So that's what I ended up working with. With that data set, what I ended up really looking at was the difference between different types of employer incentives and how that impacts transit choice. And the different types of employer incentives I looked at were financial incentives, like subsidies, paying for a transit cost or most of a transit cost, educational incentives, like teaching people where the stops are, giving a new employee hire packet, something like that. And then human resources type incentives, like having a company car, offering flex time, different things that might encourage a person to take transit because they know that they'll have options to get around while they're at work. I wanted to start by giving a little bit of background on why companies are interested in doing employee trip reduction. One of the things that really fascinates me about planning is how we all have these different specializations in the program, but all the specializations eventually come back towards each other. And with this particular area, transportation relates back to environment. A lot of these employer trip reduction efforts started in the 1970s when people were getting very concerned about environmental conditions and wanting to reduce emissions. So the Clean Air Act really got this started. In about 1990, the Clean Air Act was revised to include a section about employer trip reduction and requiring employers to try to do that as much as possible. In the 1980s, when people were very concerned about increasing congestion, cities started to require things like transportation systems management and travel demand management. And those two different areas basically regulate the amount of people who are on the transit system. So with transportation system management, companies were looking at parking for their employees and looking at how their employees were going to be able to get to work if they weren't taking their own car, different transit options. And then travel demand management goes back to the idea that we can't always control the supply. You know, we can't always build more roads, but we can control the demand for those roads by encouraging transit and giving people more options. And all of that leads into employer commute options. Basically, giving people options besides taking their own car to work. In the Portland region, we have a lot of different agencies that work on employer commute options. Of course, TriMet, who I was working with, works with different employers to give them a variety of different incentive packages to encourage their employees to take the bus or take Max or carpool. There are other agencies, of course, that work on that as well. The Department of Environmental Quality in Oregon actually regulates our official employer commute program. That requires employers that have over 50 employees to do something to regulate their employees' single occupancy vehicle use. It requires them to survey their employees about their transit behavior, report that to DEQ, and then do something to reduce that by about 10%. Their compliance with that rule is based on a good faith effort. The employer checks in with the regulating agency, in this case TriMet, and lets them know what they're doing in order to reduce their single occupancy vehicle travel. And a lot of employers try some different things to try to make this work, and some are successful to a varying degree, but it is based on that good faith effort. What's the employer doing to try to get people out of their car and taking transit? Metro, of course, also very interested in this issue and getting people to take different forms of transit. And then I put up here a graphic also for the Lloyd District TMA. There are a lot of transportation management agencies in Portland, and what those do is for a specific geographic area, they work on the commute options. So we have someone here from Washington County from a TMA out there, and I apologize for not having their picture up here, but the Lloyd TMA was the one that I was able to get. And they actually were very helpful with this research as well. I did talk to someone over there early on. So looking at this data set that I had, I really wanted to research the effects these incentives had on transit use. I also wanted to know if there were differences between the financial incentives, which is what we all think of, I think, typically when we're trying to get people out of their car. We think about, well, pay them, give them money to take transit. But I wanted to look at there were differences with these other types of incentives as well. Of course, land use, we know, has a big impact on what people choose to do when they decide how to get to work in the morning, so I wanted to look at land use as well. And then, of course, does free parking trump all? If there's free parking available, does nothing else we do matter? People are always going to choose to drive. And that's something that there's been quite a bit of research about. The data that I received from TriMet was the most recent annual survey from the employers who work with TriMet on receiving some sort of transit program. These are not all employers who are required to do something with that eco rule. These are just employers who wanted to work with TriMet. So some of these are smaller than 50 employees. Some of them fall under some different guidelines or regulations. So in this entire data set, there were 831 employer records. I should say that these employer records did not include employee-specific data. That's why this isn't a full mode choice model. We don't know a lot about the employees who are working for these companies. TriMet does collect individual surveys from the employees, but the only geographic information we have on them is their zip code. That's too big of a geographic area to really get an idea of why they're choosing to take transit. We do have an idea of what different modes they're taking, what days of the week they're taking different modes, and some different factors that they say would impact them, but that's not included in this particular data set. I was able to get the specific employer records for 5 or 6 different employer sites and started evaluating that before I decided to stick with this aggregate data set. However, in the future, I think that another student is going to take that on. So these 831 records are aggregate records for each different employer site. And it's a pretty robust data set, considering that it's only the employer side. It has the trip rates by mode. It has a lot of information about what different types of incentives the employer offers. And that's pretty specific down to what type of financial incentive, what type of HR incentive, what types of educational pieces they're giving their employees. It also has in there whether or not they're using programs besides TriMet's. A lot of these employers are, or they're just doing something internally. So this data set did include that information as well. Obviously, number of employees, some different demographic data like that. I wanted to look at what amenities they offer for bicyclists. I thought that bike amenities could have a negative impact on transit usage because some people who take transit might choose to ride their bike if there's a shower and a bike locker available, so I rolled that into my data set. I also knew the location because we were able to get addresses for these employers, and so they were geocoded. We had the parking information, at least as far as whether or not there was free parking available at the site. We do have some information about the cost of parking or how much the employer subsidizes, but we were worried that we didn't have specific enough information to feed that into this model. That's something that I think would be great for a future model. And then we had information again about those benefits, what I call the HR benefits. So flex time, compressed work week, telecommuting, different things that would impact someone's travel choice. This is just some different descriptive information about that data. The mode split in here is an average. That shows you that we do have mostly single occupancy vehicle, but for people who know what the mode split typically is in this region, you know that that's actually kind of a low single occupancy vehicle mode split. More people in that take transit. This again is a specific data set of people who work with TriMet already, so they probably have a slightly higher transit or bike, walk, or carpool share than other employers. But you can still see that single occupancy vehicle is by far the most common mode of getting to work. The frequency then for the percent of bus max I thought was interesting because this is the frequency of employers within each of those different percentage bins. You can see most employers really do have almost no transit share at all. A lot of them are all single occupancy vehicle. So then looking more deeply into that transit share, I wanted to look at these employers that are enrolled in TriMet's Passport program. The Passport program is probably the premier transit incentive program that TriMet can offer to people. Passport is based on a survey that the employer completes. What that survey shows is how many of their employees are already regularly taking transit. Based on that number, TriMet offers them a deal on these employee passes that allow them to take transit with very easily. It's just a sticker that goes on your ID card, or they give you an ID card. And that's something that the employer can offer to all of their eligible employees, not just the ones who are already taking transit. It's a great employee incentive. A lot of employers like to do it just for recruiting purposes. So within this data set, the passport employers are a little bit special. We know that they're offering some sort of a subsidized transit already, and we know that they are pretty open to using transit and probably fairly supportive of their employees in general. So I wanted to look at what the difference is between the transit share. Even within the passport program, you can see that they have pretty low transit share, but their distribution is much better than the non-passport program, which has many more of them using no transit or very small amounts of transit. As you can see by the numbers here, passport program was 241 of my employers, non-passport was 590. So the numbers on the scale bars of these two graphs are different. You can still get an idea for how the frequency is different. So then I wanted to look at the transit cost for these sites. When the transit cost variable was put together, I worked with my contact at TriMet. We were a little bit concerned that employer sites that are using the passport program are able to get those passes at a discounted price, again, because it's based on the number of their employees who are already using transit. So we didn't want to say that a passport employee is paying 100% of their transit cost if they buy a pass, because maybe their employee is getting those passes for 70% of the cost. So this variable was normalized for that effect. This is the actual percentage that the passport employees are paying for a full cost of a transit price. We are balancing out basically for how much their employee was subsidizing up front, or how much their employer was being subsidized up front. And you can see through these distributions then that the passport program employees are getting a pretty good deal. A lot of them are not paying very much at all of their transit cost, whereas with the non-passport program, most of their employees are paying almost all of the cost of their transit passes. I think it's interesting that there's a little bump in the middle for the transit cost for the non-passport employees. I think that there are quite a few employers out there who are doing their own program of some sort, so clearly there's quite a few who are offering about a 50% discount. Since I had the location, I was able to do some supplementary geographic information. That was the land use that's around these individual sites, whether or not it is near transit stops, transit routes, specifically for bus or for light rail. I was able to determine if they were located within Fareless Square, east or west. We split those out initially because there's obviously some different land uses and parking prices in West Fareless Square, which is downtown, versus East Fareless Square, which is around the Lloyd Center. Wanted to see if there were any different effects there. In addition to being free, obviously, to take transit around Fareless Square, it's a pretty interesting proxy for some different land uses that we don't see anywhere else in our region. I think it would have been interesting to compare the downtown results that I have to some other downtown that wasn't a Fareless Square, that had the same land use mix and density and number of employees, but we just don't have that option in this region. That's our only downtown, and it happens to be Fareless Square. Of course, the fact that it's in Fareless Square doesn't mean that transit is free for these people. They're probably coming from somewhere where they have to pay initially to take transit into Fareless Square. But it does mean that during the day they can get around for free on the bus or on streetcar or MAX. The block group characteristics, I looked at the population, density, some different variables that I was able to get from the U.S. Census, and then characteristics of the transportation analysis zones that these employers were located in as well. I want to talk about the land use variable that I used for a moment. This is a variable that Jennifer Dill has used and has done quite a bit of analysis on. It's called the connected node ratio. Basically, the connected node ratio at the census tract level looks at the number of intersections divided by the number of intersections plus the number of cul-de-sacs. What it gives you an idea of is how connected the streets are. Are people able to travel around all of the streets, or are they going to end up at dead ends where they can't get through? As you can see, looking at this map, the best connected node ratio is in downtown, and over on the east side of the river. I don't think that's anything we're too surprised by. But once you get out further into the counties, into Washington, Clackamas County, and even East Multnomah County, we have a much lower connected node ratio. The pure green you're seeing is about 50 to 60%. The yellow, which is down in Clackamas County, it looks like, is between 46 and 50%. I also put the max line on this map because I was a little bit worried that the connected node ratio was going to correlate with the max. I thought that there might be some connection between the type of connectivity and whether or not there was a max stop there. Fortunately, thanks to the airport in Washington County, that's not an issue. There is much less connected node ratio in both of those areas. So there wasn't a correlation with max stops and the connected node ratio. It does give you an idea of the different land use patterns, though, that we're looking at, and clearly the Fareless square areas have a very high connected node ratio. So these are the eco-option sites that I was looking at, the sites that TriMet was working with. I was also initially a little bit concerned that these sites were going to be clustered in downtown or clustered along a max line. And I was really happy when I looked at these geocoded results because it shows that they're not. They are distributed throughout our region pretty well. There are some clusters, obviously in downtown and some places along the max line, but there's also some clusters along the freeways, particularly along that 217 corridor. So I thought that it was a pretty good distribution to look at. From there, I started to build my regression analysis, and I apologize for how text-heavy this slide is, but when I started doing this analysis, I had a lot of different variables connected, and I kept putting in different variables and trying to build this model that really captured a lot of these different characteristics. What I found was that I had a whole lot of correlation with the variables that I was using. So these variables that made it onto this slide are the ones that did not correlate or did correlate but didn't affect the overall model, but still I thought did a pretty good job of explaining what's happening with this employer site that's encouraging people to take transit. So I came up with commute choice as a function of availability of free parking at the work site, obviously. If you can drive to work and it's free and you have a car, you're probably likely to drive to work. Those human resources incentives, we weren't sure if those would have a negative effect or no effect because some of them you think, well, if there's flex time, that just means someone can get to work at 9 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock at night. But I also think that that could have an effect on someone's wanting to use transit if they know it might take them a little longer to get to work because they use transit, but they're willing to take that because they want to take transit instead of driving their car. I think it could have an effect on it, and that's actually what we ended up finding. But the guaranteed ride home, definitely something that encourages people to take transit. If you're worried that you're going to be at work, your kid's going to get sick, you're not going to be able to go pick them up, you're probably not likely to take transit. And then having a company car, you have some flexibility while you're at work if you need to travel for business. Distance to transit, obviously huge. If people are not close to transit, they're not going to want to take transit. The employment characteristics around the workplace are important. If you're in a place with a good employment mix, then you're probably in a place where there are other services, doctor's offices, a place to walk to lunch, a place to get your dry cleaning, some different things available that make you okay without having a car when you're at work. Street connectivity, as we discussed, I thought that would be pretty important. The max could be right there, but if you can't walk there because it's all cul-de-sacs, you're not going to want to take transit. The amenities available for biking, again, I was interested to see if that would have a negative effect or if it would just be another thing in the bundle that shows that this employer is pretty open to different forms of mode split. The size of the employer, are bigger employers more likely to have these types of programs or incentives? And then participation in the passport program, is that particular bundle of incentives enough by itself to have an impact versus the cost of transit? And those two correlated with each other really strongly, so they were actually put into different models. The full model 1 for the statistics people in the audience, this is what it looked like with the beta coefficients, and that's those variables I just talked about in addition to the passport variable. And then the full model 2 substituted out transit cost in place of the passport variable. And this is what that regression analysis ended up looking like. A lot of people told me when I started working with this data set that I wouldn't be able to get a very high R-squared no matter what because I didn't have any of that employee level data. And they were saying without that, you don't know where they're coming from, you don't know how close they are to transit at home, you don't know if they have a car or not. So this probably isn't going to be able to explain their behavior. But my R-squared value for both of these models ended up at 0.575 or about 57%. And I was pretty pleased with that. I think considering that this is only employer level data, we are being able to show some of these different variables really impacting someone's choice of transit. The variables that I've highlighted with the yellow circles are the ones that I was particularly interested in looking at. What you can see from this, the highest beta coefficient, and the asterisk next to them means that they're significant at the 95% confidence interval. The connected node ratio was really high and had a really high impact with that beta square value. And that's something that carried across the submodels that I did as well. So clearly having street connectivity near the employer is very important. But that's not something that employers can really change so much unless they pick up their employer site and they move it. So I was more interested in these other variables that the employer can actually do something about. And that's where I looked at the free parking. Free parking is statistically significant and has about a 10% impact on the choice of mode split. The HR incentive is actually a little bit higher, the value of 0.117 or about 11.7%. And I thought that was interesting because I'd really expected free parking to have the greatest effect out of all of these variables, and it turns out that it did not. The max within a quarter mile of these employment sites did also have a really high effect, a little bit higher than that HR incentive or free parking, so clearly having access to max is pretty important. I'll talk a little bit more about my submodel in a moment that deals with that specifically. And then the transit cost in the passport program were highly significantly significant, but they did not have the same magnitude of effect as some of those other variables. So that was interesting to me. I would always assume that transit cost would be the first thing people would look at. There's a whole lot of research out there that says transit cost really doesn't matter at all, and this is kind of showing that that's true. Not that it doesn't matter because it is significant, but that it doesn't have as great of an impact as these land use variables and some of these other incentives that the employer can offer. Actually, within this model, all of these variables, with the exception of bike amenity in Model 1, were significant. The bike amenity did have that negative effect that I thought that it might have, but it's a very small magnitude. So looking at those full models, I wanted to look at these subgroups because I thought, well, you know, things like free parking, if a site is located within Fareless Square or if a site has the passport program available, what are some of these subgroups doing? Are they acting differently from the full model? So I created 3 different subgroups: the passport employees versus the other employees, whether they're within a quarter mile of a max stop versus sites that are farther away from a max stop, and whether they're within Fareless Square or outside. Looking at only max and not bus is something that I had to do. As many of you know, we have a really good bus network in this city, and almost all of my sites were within a quarter mile of a bus stop. So then I looked at frequent bus stops instead and thought, okay, well, maybe it's frequent bus service. But most of my sites that were within frequent bus service were also really close to a max stop, so I couldn't put both of those into the same model. I also found that a lot of the sites really were really close to a frequent bus stop as well. There were only a few that weren't close to a frequent bus stop, a handful. So that part of the model didn't work out very well for me. There's some benefits for max that a lot of researchers have looked at, are light rail versus bus. A lot of people prefer light rail, so I thought it would be important to look at bus as well, but I ended up using light rail because of those statistical issues. I also used a Chow test. A Chow test shows whether or not submodels are statistically different from the main model. And in all 3 of these cases, my Chow test results showed that these subgroups are different from the whole. So this is a map showing you the distribution of the passport sites versus the regular sites. I wanted to make sure that there wasn't any bias in their geographic distribution, and as you can see, there isn't. The passport sites are the little green stars, the non-passport are the red dots. They're distributed pretty well. Passport sites seems to be clustered along the max line to a certain degree, but not necessarily with that 217 corridor and then going down I-5. And actually, there were quite a few up in North Portland and Northeast Portland, which was interesting. And that's what this submodel looks like. Our squared score is higher for the passport program, but it's still pretty high for the non-passport program. And you can see from the beta coefficients, this model is behaving differently from that main model. Free parking is important in both cases. Free parking is having a greater negative effect for the passport sites. I'm not sure why that was happening exactly. The HR incentive, though, is still very significant, and it's a greater magnitude for those non-passport sites, which means that for these non-passport sites, maybe the employer isn't subsidizing transit cost quite so much, but they're offering some of these HR incentives, and that can really have an impact. Maybe there's a reason the employer can't subsidize transit, but they could still probably use some of these HR incentives. So I thought that was an interesting result. Again, the connected node ratio, really high beta coefficient and statistically significant. So we come back to that land use as being very, very important. In this particular model, the transit cost was not statistically significant, and it didn't behave exactly the way that I thought that it would within the passport model. But as you saw from the descriptive variables distribution, there's a pretty high subsidization rate within those passport sites, and so I think that was interfering with how that variable was interacting. And it does have the right sign in the no passport sites, but that could be due to the fact that it wasn't statistically significant, could be due to the fact of how these other variables were acting. So then moving on to my Fareless Square submodel. These are the 2 different sections of Fareless Square. Again, I wanted to leave Fareless Square as a dummy variable in that main model, but it ended up correlating really strongly with a lot of the other variables. So this is what Fareless Square looks like. I did lump them together, even though they're shown differently on this map in different colors, but all of those sites were put together for Fareless Square in this model. So the Fareless Square is all those sites put together. This model really doesn't have a very high R squared. It wasn't these variables aren't explaining what's going on. Within Fareless Square and outside of Fareless Square is basically what we learned from this model. But to that effect, the HR incentive is still having a pretty high effect in both areas, or particularly in the Fareless Square side. Connected node ratio is not statistically significant within Fareless Square. Guess why? Everywhere in Fareless Square is pretty well connected already. I'd be surprised if it wasn't really highly connected. So that variable is probably not as relevant within that particular submodel. But the connected node ratio is significant, and it's having an impact in those outside of Fareless Square areas. So again, showing us that the connected node ratio is pretty important. And the transit cost in that outside of Fareless Square, again, having an effect. Within Fareless Square, parking is expensive. It's pretty much the only area within the Portland Metro where you know that people are always going to have to pay for parking for the most part. So I think that's why the transit cost wasn't significant. But the transit cost is having an effect in those outside of Fareless Square sites still. And then the max within a quarter mile. Obviously, you would know geographically where all of these sites are. This subgroup, again, had a fairly low R-squared, especially for the no max, but for the max it was 0.462. Clearly a lot of other things going on, some different variables that could be put into these models that would explain this behavior a little bit better. But what you're seeing with these different models is that if max isn't available, free parking isn't statistically significant, people don't have a whole lot of other options probably, transit probably isn't as available or as attractive. Within the sites that have max, though, free parking is still a pretty high impact. So even if max is available, having that free parking there is going to pull people off of transit. In both cases, that HR incentive is, again, effective. In sites with max, the HR incentive has a pretty high beta coefficient, I thought, so that's showing that just because you're close to max doesn't mean you're in the home free. Offering this HR incentive will also really encourage your employees to take transit. And then the transit cost, again, significant in both cases and having an impact, but not the same magnitude as that HR incentive. This model for the regression is slightly different, and that's because I had the access to max as a dummy variable in that main model, had to pull it out because obviously it's going to be 1 or 0 for either of these two different subgroups. So the results of all of those tables. Financial incentives do have an effect on transit use for the most part in these models that I built. But these HR incentives also really have an effect on transit use. And I think that for employers that for whatever reason aren't able to offer a financial incentive, or they're already offering a financial incentive and they want to see some more results, offering some of these HR incentives can be something that will have an impact on their transit use. The free parking, the one that I expected to trump all of the other variables, it is significant in a lot of these cases. But in a lot of these cases, the other variables have a higher magnitude, a beta coefficient, which means that they're having more of an effect than the free parking. And finally, the street connectivity has a really high impact on transit use. And that can be difficult. Some of these employers can, of course, pick up their routes and move, but maybe they could work with a package of some of these other things that are available in order to encourage their employees to take transit, even though they're not necessarily in the best connected of all areas. There is a lot of room for future research on this particular data set and then going out and getting that employee level data from the employers as well. Also working with some of the different TMAs to get some more specific data that they might be collecting about their employer sites. Place of residence data, of course, would be very, very important, knowing how many cars people have, where they live, how close to transit they are at home, and how close to transit they are at work. Those different variables would be very important. All kinds of different land use mix variables that you could put into this model, although I think the connectivity ratio was a pretty good one to use. Actual cost of parking, I think, would be huge, and that's something that I really wanted to look at early on, so it was a little bit too bad that I couldn't, but I think that's something someone could do in the future. We could flip all of these regressions around and look at the effects on other types of transportation, not just transit, look at the single occupancy vehicles, look at biking and walking, look at carpooling. A lot of different options for models there. And then there's also a possibility of using the change in time data from TriMet, since they do collect this data in series over time. So that's another big possibility, seeing what effect this is having over a couple of years. With that, I'd like to do my acknowledgements. Jennifer Dill and Jim Strathman are my readers for my field area paper, and both of them have been very helpful in developing statistical analysis. Caleb Winter was my contact at TriMet, who helped me get the data and work with the data. He's since moved over to Metro, so he'll be starting a new job there, but very helpful, good person to work with. And then TriMet staff, I was able to present this to them earlier this week and get some feedback from them on the results, so I really appreciate their help. And with that, open for questions.
Questions for about 10 minutes or so, and I'll remind everyone to use the microphone when they do ask the questions.
Tony Rifflow.
Sorry, I can't reach the microphone. Erin, you mentioned that a lot of the variables are correlated with each other. And in particular, many of them are correlated or inversely correlated with downtown versus non-downtown. And
Right.
we know the transit share is higher. For example, free parking is much less likely downtown, and a variety of the other things. How can you draw conclusions given the high correlation with the variables that were omitted?
As I said in the beginning, that was how I chose the variables that I put in. Either they had a lower correlation score with each other, or the correlation wasn't affecting the rest of the models. So it wasn't impacting the beta of the other variables that were in there. You do know that there's going to be correlations between things like the connectivity ratio and access to max. As I discussed, that wasn't as big as I thought that it probably would be. So I was able to control for some of that. And I do have my correlation statistics, which I can go over with you if you want to look at how that worked. Max.
Did your employer information include anything about the kind of pay scale of the people?
No, and that's something else that I think would be really useful. We know that income has a really big impact on why someone would choose transit, or what share of their income they're paying for transportation. So when we can get that employee level data, if we could know what salary class they're in, I think that would be really helpful. I also think it would be really helpful to know the industry code, like the SIC code for these different employer sites, and that's something that probably could be added to this data set. Since TriMet knows, I didn't know who these employers were. They didn't tell me what the name of the employer site was, but TriMet knows that, and they would know or be able to get the SIC codes. So I think that could have an impact on it as well. Yeah.
Did you consider the speed ratio of perhaps taking a bus as opposed to driving, or did you consider that more negligible? Not so much the walking to the stop, but more, the bus making stops along the way?
That would be possible to do if you had that employee level data and we knew what distance they were traveling. Since we didn't know the distance, it wouldn't be possible to do that so much. With the connectivity ratio, you can get at that a little bit. If there's a better connectivity, it'd be faster to walk, because the streets are better connected. But since we didn't have that distance variable in there, I think that'd be really difficult to do with this data. Brian?
I was trying to understand how some of your beta coefficients correspond to actual transit mode shares.
Okay.
For example, the connected mode ratio, I'm just trying to understand the beta coefficient. So if you got 40, does that mean, what does that mean, 49%?
The way the beta coefficient works, and I'll use free parking as an example, is that for a site that has free parking, their transit share is going to be negative 10%. So 10% less than a site that does not have the free parking, essentially. Yeah.
So were there some clear recommendations that you made either to TriMet or employers to improve the incentives program?
The recommendations that I would come away from this is that looking at those HR incentives is pretty valuable because they are having as much of an impact as the financial share. Also, what I'd like to see TriMet be able to do with this data is specifically look at each employer they're working with. They work with these employers one-on-one when they're offering them these transit packages. Look at where they're located, look at their distance to max for the bus, look at their size of their company, some different statistics about their employees, and then look at what incentives they're already offering, and then be able to say, okay, we don't have any HR incentives, maybe that would really bump up our share, or we're not subsidizing their transit at all, maybe offering some sort of a subsidy would have some help. Or if we're looking for a new location, maybe we should pick one that has a better connected node ratio than another one. So I think that there's some clear recommendations that can be drawn from this. Tom?
Let's make a comment about a potential omitted variable, and that is the quantity of service provided at the employment location would seem to be a huge determinant of percent mode share. So if I'm at a location that I'm served, by say 3 buses per hour every 20 minutes during the peak, that's far different than somebody in a downtown or Lloyd Center location that has access to multiple routes, multiple trips.
And that was something that we really wanted to look at, especially in future models. If we knew more about where these employees were coming from, and especially the number of transfers that they have to make in order to get to their employer site, I think that would be really valuable to add into this.
I understand that you don't have any information on the employee level, but the amount of service provided would work at this level of aggregation for this model.
Actually, I have a question from the web.
Okay.
That I know the answer to, but I'll ask.
Well, you can answer
I
it.
won't just email him back. The student was asking if you came across anything about cashing out free parking. Was there any information about whether that was an option at any of these employment sites?
No, we didn't have the cash out option. Like I said, there was some information included about the cost of parking, but it wasn't, I was told by my contact at TriMet that it wasn't necessarily complete for all of the employer sites, and I didn't have information specifically about whether or not they could cash out their parking or what amount they could cash it out.
We actually have more questions.
Yay.
People do watch on the web, which is why we do make you use the microphone. So this question is, how do you account for the potential bias in the data set provided by TriMet?
There is bias in this data set because these are employers who are already working with TriMet. Obviously, they're interested in changing their mode split. They want their employees to take transit. But I would say within this data set, there's clearly a range of employers and their mode split. You have employers in this data set who have no transit use whatsoever. You have employers in this data set who are fully subsidizing transit, and employers in this data set who aren't offering any sort of financial subsidy at all. You have employers out in the suburbs with no access to transit. You have employers in downtown that have great access to all kinds of transit. So I would say it's not a really good representation of the entire metro area, but it is a representation of some different types of employers. And so I think it's still valuable. You wouldn't be able to get this data for the entire metro area, or this level of data, because it needs to be employer sites who are working with TriMet and are giving up this amount of information. That would be really hard to do for all of the employers in the region.
One last web question. Is there any information in the data about offering free bikes or flex car as an employer HR incentive?
There was information about offering flex car. It wasn't created as a variable. It was put over on the side as just a note about something extra that employer offered. And I did actually look at that specifically because I was interested in, obviously, the transit accessibility or their ability to move around while they were at work. All of the sites that said they had flex car available also had one of those other HR incentives. So all of those sites were rolled into that dummy variable for having an HR incentive. As far as free bikes, that was not available in the data set.
That was the last one, but someone else sent one in, and I think we do have time. This is the last question. Did you look at pre-tax incentives for transit costs? Because some employers can sell transit passes pre-tax. And were you able to factor that incentive in?
I don't believe that was factored into the cost of transit because, again, I worked with TriMet to develop that cost of transit variable. I'd have to ask them if that was accounted for. It wouldn't affect the share of the transit cost because that would have still been normalized, I believe, for the data set. Although I should say with the tax incentives, with the passport program, that's something that both employers and employees within those companies can benefit from. So that's just another thing that would roll into that great package of belonging to the passport program. So I think that the pre-tax incentives could be something you would look at specifically maybe in a future model.
So we'll do the switch. Thank you very much, Erin. So in case you missed the introduction, our next speaker is Sumi Malik, also a second-year, soon-to-graduate MURP student.
Okay, everything's on. Good afternoon. My name is Sumi Malik, as Jennifer mentioned, and today I'm going to be talking to you about exploring factors that are influencing differences between perceived walking distance to light rail transit stations and actual walking distances to light rail transit stations. And this is an outgrowth of my research with Jennifer Dill as her graduate research assistant. So why this study? Well, first of all, I was interested in this notion of how an individual's perception influences their behavior, and also vice versa. How does an individual's behavior influence their perception? logic would say that if a person actually uses transit, perhaps they would be more accurate in determining what walking distances are to that light rail, to that transit station. And also I wanted to quantify, generally, do individuals underestimate or overestimate walking distances to light rail transit stations? So just to tell you what I'm going to be sharing with you today, some of my research questions, the sites and the survey methodology, analysis methodology, my findings, and opportunities for future analysis and research. First of all, as far as the research questions, is there a significant difference between survey respondents' perception of light rail, of distance and actual distance to light rail transit stations? I just wanted to answer that basic question and see if there was a significant difference. And if there is a significant difference, are these differences in perceived walking distance influenced by use of transit, the environment around, whether or not it's quote-unquote new urbanist, and other demographic factors? Some of the policy implications for this type of a question, there may be, if there are actual differences between perceived walking distance and network distances to light rail transit stations, perhaps this begs the question of should there be better wayfinding signs, like a sign that states X number of minutes to the closest light rail transit station, or X distance to the closest light rail transit station. And also the placement of stations themselves relative to development, or vice versa. Is there, if perceptions of walking distance are so far off, does this mean that transit stations should ideally be located closer to light rail transit stops, or that development should be located closer to stations? So these were the survey sites. They were all along the west side light rail transit station, around Beaverton, Central Max Station, El Monica Station, and Orenco Station. Here you can see they were roughly, all of them were about within a half-mile distance, straight line distance. A little bit of a close-up view. So these are the sites that were investigated at Orenco Station. Here we have original Orenco Station towards the top, right here. And these were broken down into both those places that were multifamily as well as those places that were single family. Sunset Downs is one of the more traditional sort of areas. It's, as you can see, it has some of these cul-de-sacs. It's an older development. Club 1201, mainly condominiums. And then Arbor Homes, that's actually closer to the original Orenco development. And these are also very much townhome sort of style, a little bit like the new urbanist style. So these are some pictures of the development of the original Orenco development. Here you can see these are the single-family homes, and here are some of the condos that are there. I'm sure many of you have gone there and are somewhat familiar with what the area looks like. As you know, it's actually a good distance. Most of the homes are a half-mile away from the light rail transit station, and this is the walk to the light rail transit station. It's not what one would typically think of a pleasant pedestrian walk, so bear that in mind as we go through the results. There are a lot of vacant lands, a lot of large lots still undeveloped there, so this is what the walking environment is like. Then Orenco Station. Arbor Homes. So Arbor Homes is also what I would characterize as new urbanist, although it wasn't necessarily marketed that way, but it is close to light rail transit. You can see some of the townhome styles here, and even these more traditional homes that have a garage in front are on fairly skinny lots, pretty small lots, and they have features like this, like cut-through pedestrian paths, and some amenities like that I've chosen to characterize as new urbanist. Then El Monica Station, we surveyed 2 sites around El Monica Station, these condominiums here, and also another Arbor home development that's very similar to the one around Orenco. And you can see these are actually quite a bit closer, about a 1/4 mile straight line distance from the light rail transit station. These are the condos. They are, the station is right behind the condos there. And these are the Arbor home, this is the Arbor home development. Again, you can see a little bit more traditional, but still very high density, and these townhomes here. Then we surveyed folks at the Round at Beaverton, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this development as well. It's right next to the transit station, and it's primarily condominiums with first floor retail. So as far as the survey methodology itself, the survey instrument was a mail-back survey. And on the survey, I asked the question about how long would it take you to walk from home to the closest max light rail station. Now, I asked this question in terms of travel time instead of how far do you think it is because I wanted to get the highest response rate as possible. And I thought intuitively people think in terms of travel time when they're walking places more so than actual distance. And I wanted to limit the amount of don't knows that I got. I wanted people to take a stab at answering the question by putting down X number of minutes to the closest light rail transit station. The survey instrument also asked about their travel behavior, so whether or not they use transit. It also asked about their attitudes towards travel and their attitude and their housing preferences, which I did not examine those kinds of variables in this study. We gave them an upfront incentive, a $3 Starbucks card. And this is sort of like an upfront guilt trip to get them to complete the survey. And we actually got a pretty good response. We got a response rate of 29%, although most of those respondents came back in the first round of surveys that we sent. And then just to give you an idea of how people within each, the response rates within each neighborhood or within each station, this is what the responses were like. And at Orenco Station, we got the highest amount of responses, but then we also sampled more people there. So how did I calculate perceived distance given that travel time that people reported? I used what the Highway Capacity Manual suggests for signal timing, which was a rate of 4 feet per second. And so that's what I used to convert this perceived travel time into an actual distance. Now for actual distance, how did I figure out what actual distance was? Well, I used ArcGIS Network Analyst, and these network distances were used as the actual distance. And what I've done here is just highlighted a few of the routes. So what Network Analyst does, these are the survey respondents, and what Network Analyst does is it basically will create a path based on the street network grid, the shortest path to the closest light rail transit station. Whether or not this is actual is debatable. This was the best data that I had. This was what I could use. As you saw in the pictures with Arbor Homes and also with Orenco Station, there are parks and perhaps some cut-through areas for pedestrians where the pedestrian network may be different from the street network that I've used for actual distances. So bear that in mind as well as we go through the results. So the analysis methodology, first of all, I eliminated any respondents who reported any kind of physical or mental anxiety that prohibited them to walk outside or use transit. So I really wanted to get at those people where they didn't have any kind of limitations. And I wanted to first establish, is there a difference between perceived distance versus network distance? I did a paired sample test, and then I did a linear regression. So just doing a straight scatter plot on the perceived distance versus network distance, what you can see here is the slope is greater than 1, which means that people are tending to actually underestimate the time that it takes them to walk places. For very short distances, about 1/10 of a mile, which is about 2 to 3 blocks or so, people tend to overestimate the time that it takes them to walk places. But you can see in this area, I have actually not very many cases. And my thinking behind that, why did I get that result? I'm thinking that when people are answering the survey, they probably think there's a minimum amount of time that it takes them to walk someplace, like maybe 5 minutes. It's probably not likely that somebody would answer 2.5 minutes. And so for greater distances, it seems like people tend to underestimate the time that it actually takes them to walk places. So is this difference significant? Using the paired sample test, it looks as if my t-statistic is significant at the 95% confidence level. And so there is a significant difference between people's perceived walking distance to light rail transit stations and the actual distance. Taking a look at the factors, what is contributing to this difference in perceived distance? Well, the independent factors, well, first of all, I took the log of perceived distance so that I could ultimately estimate an elasticity, and I also took the log of network distance. I entered in a variable called new urbanist, and that was a binary variable, meaning 1 for yes, it is new urbanist, 0 if it's not. And for new urbanist, if it was intentionally developed as a TOD, if it was on a street, if it was on a well-connected grid, I counted that as being new urbanist. The 2 places that I did not count as new urbanist were Sunset Downs and actually also Club 1201, because when walking around there, the routes are somewhat circuitous, and it is almost like a large parking lot with some condominiums kind of put in there. So, and just to talk a little bit about the lack of more traditional developments, it was very hard when we were trying to find survey sites. It was very hard for us to find more traditional developments that were around these stations. A lot of the development is new, and so Sunset Downs and Club 1201 were pretty much the only ones that were developed in a little bit more of a traditional way. Then I have a binary variable for max riders. If somebody used max 1 or more times during the month for commute purposes, I counted them as a max rider. And the thinking behind that is the more that they use max, if they do actually have some experience walking to the light rail transit station, that perhaps that would increase their ability to predict an accurate walking distance. And then years in residence, I also used years in residence because the logic behind that is that the longer somebody lives in a place, perhaps the more likely they are to predict their walking distances more accurately. The mean for this was actually under a year because a lot of the development is very new at these stations. The people hadn't lived there for very long, so there isn't a lot of variation within that one variable. Income, it was an ordinal variable, and you'll be able to see that broken out a little bit more later in the presentation. Age, I decided to include because I thought that certainly one's ability, how quickly they can move, will impact how long they perceive it would take them to walk to a light rail transit station. And then gender, obviously binary factor. So for max riders, to take a little bit of a closer look at max riders, within each neighborhood, the highest rate of max ridership was at Arbor Homes Orenco Station, which they're actually relatively close, and also original Orenco, the multifamily part, not so much the single family, at Orenco Station. And then income by neighborhood, they were all somewhat grouped similarly. The reason why I chose to use income is because transit is typically thought of as an inferior good. Usually as people's incomes increase, they tend to use transit less. And Club 1201 here, these are condominiums. It seems like the median income is $35,000 to $50,000 per household. This may be because there are a lot of single people there. Similarly, let's see at El Monaco condos, it's like that. However, Beaverton Round was relatively high, so just some information on the income. So my linear regression, the adjusted R-squared was 0.62, so the model I felt was fairly good at predicting the variability between perceived distances, about a 63%. The resulting sample that I had was 189 cases, and those cases in which any one of the variables was missing, they were eliminated. And here's some information on my coefficients, the resulting coefficients. Those that are bolded are the ones that are significant. So network distance, the log of network distance is significant, which makes sense. Hopefully, the further away the actual distance is, that has an impact on people's perception of distance. So that makes sense. The one thing that's interesting is that it is, the elasticity is actually less than 1. And so what this means is that for a 10% increase in in actual network distance, there's a 7% increase in people's perception of that distance. New urbanist also was significant and was negative, and what this means is that people who were in new urbanist environments perceive shorter distances by about 25%. And so they perceive greater accessibility, and I'll talk a little bit about why that may or may not be. Years in residence wasn't significant, not a big surprise because there wasn't very much variation in there. Max ridership wasn't significant either. It may be because there really weren't that many max riders. In my entire sample of 243, there were only 34 people who I characterized as max riders. And then income also was not significant. Age was significant, which makes sense because those people who, and also the way that I asked the question, I asked in terms of how long would it take you to walk someplace. And ideally, for those people who are 60, 65 or older, I should have probably used a slower rate to calculate the perceived distance. And so it's not a surprise to me, since I used the same rate for the whole population, that age ended up being significant. So some of the policy implications. So differences between perceived and actual distances do exist. Overall, the tendency is to underestimate distance, which is kind of interesting because anecdotally, my teaching has been that people tend to overestimate walking distances places, especially if they normally drive places and they don't have that much experience walking. Some policy implications with this: wayfinding signs would be good to improve the accuracy by which people perceive that distance. So if there were signs that said 10 minutes, like in Orenco station, if there were signs that said 5-minute walk to Max Light Rail Transit Station, this may improve people's ability to predict those distances. Also, those in new urbanist neighborhoods perceive greater accessibility. This could be maybe the marketing was really great and people actually do believe that they're closer than they are. Or the other thing may be that these sort of cut-through paths, these amenities like parks where pedestrians can walk through and they don't have to be bound to the street network grid, maybe these design elements are actually making a difference. And then for future results, relating these results to other MAC stations, I'm very hesitant to relate these results to other MAC stations because I do think that with these types of studies, they're very highly dependent on the location, and because the facts on the ground here may be very different from the facts on the ground elsewhere, I am hesitant to attribute these same results to other MAC stations. And then with the question of should development be closer to MAX light rail stations, well, perhaps locating MAX light rail stations actually closer to development or vice versa, development closer to MAX light rail stations would improve people's ability to predict that walking distance. And then consideration of age, because age was significant in this situation. When creating developments, if the population is targeted at kind of more people who are retirees or empty nesters, perhaps that their ability to walk at a slower pace should be taken into consideration. So, issues and future research. First of all, the issue of response bias. When administering a survey that's asking questions about do you walk and bike, do you use transit, I'm thinking that people who actually do that would probably be inclined to respond more because they may feel like they have something to actually report. So I do think that in this case there is some response bias. Comparison to studies, one thing that I would like to do is compare these results to studies from other researchers. And then identify other factors within the survey. Some of the questions on attitudes towards travel I didn't use as factors in this survey. I really tried to limit the amount of factors that I examined to limit the collinearity among factors. And also these housing preferences. It may be interesting to take a look at some of the results of these housing preference questions and to see if that has any significance on the way that people perceive walking distances. I also think it would be important to evaluate a greater number of stations. We only looked at 3. It would be great to look at a larger number of stations to see what differences that make. And that is it. Any questions? Yes, Sean.
I'm curious, did you do a paired sample test between those you classified as max riders versus non-max riders to see if there was a difference between
a significant
perceptions?
difference? No, I didn't. That would be interesting to do, given that of my overall sample, 243 people, there were only 34 people that I characterized as max riders. That may not have as much of an impact, but it would be an interesting thing to see if that was significant. Yes?
I'm trying to intuit the new urbanist issue, and it seems to me that there's perhaps one explanation is sort of how pleasant the environment you're walking through is. That if there's a interesting streetscape, shops, et cetera, that you're not thinking about how long I have to walk. You're kind of enjoying the walk.
Right.
And what I wondered is, in your characterization of the type of environment, did you work based on the origin point or the environment they walk through? So at Orenco, I might start in a new urbanist environment, but then I walk for half a mile through a field. That's not very new urbanist.
Exactly. I did it based on the actual, I did it based on the development itself and not the distance to the light rail transit station. So that's how I chose to interpret new urbanist. Yes?
Do you think there is a seasonal variation, and when did you collect the data, and what about the weather conditions?
Interesting. That's a good question. We collected the data in the fall of 2005, and at that time it was, actually the weather was pretty decent, and we did ask questions about we did ask travel behavior questions as far as better weather and worse weather. I didn't use those because when looking at transit, we asked, do you use transit more? I mean, how often do you use transit in better weather? How often do you use transit in worse weather? And because we asked in terms of transit and not specifically max, I didn't include those variables. But we do have that information, and it may be interesting to put that in as a factor. Yes, Chris, in the back. Yeah,
Sumi. Did you walk any of these routes in some of the cut-through paths to see what the difference was?
I didn't. That would be interesting to actually walk some of these routes and not to necessarily rely exclusively on what GIS is able to calculate. We did walk through the survey sites quite a bit, but to actually walk, I mean, it might be interesting to look at one of the survey respondents to see what they answered and to actually walk the route to the max light rail station and see, just as a spot test, is that pretty accurate? Yes, Max?
On your network analyst slide, if you want to slip back that real quick. It seemed like there were some strange circuitous routes that were mapped out there. I just didn't understand them.
Right, yeah. I was curious as well with this being highlighted. Basically, with Network Analyst, what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to grab the closest max light rail station. And so that is something I was not expecting, that it would have any of this area highlighted at all, because one would think if they got to this point, it would just, and that's what...
Is that where the access point is, though? Do you know?
Well, see, that's the thing, is that there isn't, the street network doesn't lead straight to that point. So it's supposed to grab the closest max light rail transit station, but because I am relying on the street network and not some different pedestrian network, there may be some oddities like that.
Is this mapping the shortest distance paths of all your respondents, or who?
Yes, all my respondents. So I highlighted only a few of the paths within each neighborhood. So there would be lines leading from each one of these dots down.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm not sure if you said this, but maybe you could clarify. Was there a significant difference between people who did take max and didn't take max in terms of their perception of the distance?
No, there was not. There was not a significant difference. That having been said, there weren't that many people who were actually using max, so kind of take that with a grain of salt. Yes, Jennifer.
I'm wondering, did you think about also putting in straight line distance? Because I'm wondering if people if people feel that it's close, even though the street network it may not be close, but let's say they can see it, but they have to walk around to get to it, that might influence their perception.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to do. I think in the evolution of this sort of analysis, using network distance has become more popular, but in this case, especially because the pedestrian path doesn't necessarily equal the street network, and that's what I've been using to calculate actual distance, doing a straight line may be an interesting variable to put in and to see if that's, to see both, to see if that's significant. Yes, Tom.
So I thought about that question too, and but you originally stated that you the survey data asked about minutes of travel, so that's kind of a non-issue in that standpoint. My question is, with the regression, did you think about taking the difference between actual and perceived as a dependent variable? Because it seems like that's truly what you're getting at, that you're not interested in overall explaining perceived distance as a function of actual distance and a vector of other variables, but actually getting at essentially one's inability or ability to accurately gauge distances.
That would be, calculating the actual difference between the two would be interesting. I suppose I went ahead and I kept network distance on the right-hand side of the equation because I thought that would definitely explain a lot of the reason why there were these differences in perceived distance. But to just look at the differences between the two and run the regression would be interesting too. Any other questions? No? Great. Thank you.
Well, before we thank you, I'm going to do a plug for next week's seminar. We have Damon Fordham from ODOT talking about developing a sustainability program for the Oregon Department of Transportation. So I hope we see some of you there. Thank you for all coming on this start of a holiday weekend, and thanks to our two speakers.